Tennessee Capitol Report is made possible in part by...
Some games aren't played for glory. Some are played for more important reasons. That's why we partner with schools to re-energize physical education with Shape the State.
And with support by the following members of the Tennessee Credit Union League. With additional corporate support from AT&T, Rethink Possible.
The first annual session of the Senate stands in adjournment till noon on Tuesday, January 12, 2016.
In accordance with the Senate Joint Resolution 390, I hereby declare the first regular session of the House of Representatives of the 109th General Assembly of the State of Tennessee adjourned until 12 noon on Tuesday, January 12, 2016.
From the state capitol in Nashville, welcome to Tennessee Capitol Report. I'm your host, Chip Hoback. The 109th General Assembly adjourned in April, and on today's show, we'll examine this year's legislative winners and losers, and look ahead to key issues we might expect in 2016. Joining me in the conversation are Senator Mark Norris and Representative Glen Casada, representing the Republican supermajority. And later, Senator Lee Harris and Representative Mike Stewart, both Democrats. Also on our show, we'll meet Tennessee's next generation of leaders. Our cameras were rolling when middle schoolers from across the state took over the House and Senate as part of the YMCA Youth in Government program. It's all ahead on Tennessee Capitol Report. We're coming to you now from the Legislative Library here at the historic Tennessee State Capitol. And joining me to review the 109th General Assembly are Senator Mark Norris of Collierville, the Republican leader in the Senate, and the Republican caucus chair in the House, Representative Glen Casada. Welcome to Tennessee Capitol Report.
Thank you, Chip.
Well, one thing that came up this year early on was the special session the governor called the legislative session to talk about Insure Tennessee, and it didn't make it out of committee. That was one of the governor's main initiatives. What happened with the Republican Party not supporting that? What was the reasons behind that?
Well, let me begin by saying that people should be aware many bills never make it out of committee. It's not unusual for bills to be heard and debated in one committee or another and not receive the requisite votes to make it to the floor. I don't have in my head the specific statistics, but the majority of them do not come out of committee. Now, there was a committee structure during the special session. We reconvened then in regular session and went through another committee structure. Once again, that legislation did not advance in the Senate. As for the House, I'll let Glenn speak to that.
There was a lot of man hours spent in debating this issue. Several objections to the bill. One of them was it was nothing in written form. Looking at states that had enacted this expansion of Medicaid, we saw states that were suffering economically by implementing this. We saw hospitals that were closing at a greater rate. All we had to do was look at Kentucky, our neighbor to the north. They've had 2 hospitals closed this year because of the expansion. And so we felt like it was a bad economic policy and a bad public policy for the citizens of the state of Tennessee, and it did not have the votes to get out of committee.
And we've talked with other members on this show that said that in some form or fashion, this is going to come back up again. So is that one of the targets for the next legislative session?
Let me put it this way. The context should be looking at the program we have rather than another program or the program we think we'd like to have, and that's TennCare. We need to take a hard look at where we are in terms of the current expenditures. During the previous governor's administration, when TennCare got to about 30% of the state budget, he felt it necessary to make pretty drastic cuts from the rolls, and ultimately some 300,000 souls were cut off the rolls of TennCare. Today, we're at about 32%. And this was another factor in my caucus as we looked at the program we've got and whether we are managing it appropriately, as opposed to expanding without first doing our homework as to the program we've got. Many people were concerned that At 32%, we might be cutting several 100,000 people off the program we've got while talking about expanding several 100,000 of the program they would like to have. So we've got to find some equilibrium there and look at managing the program we have first.
The solution, I think, is implementing more economic business principles where there's competition to drive down prices, not government control of the industry, which raises prices and causes an increase in health care. So it will be debated next year. The Majority Leader Norris, I think, is onto something on a top-to-bottom review of TennCare, and at the same time, in which I do applaud the governor on trying to implement some economic forces into his suggestion of Medicaid expansion. We just, at this point, didn't think it was ready to be enacted because of some other problems it would create.
Well, an election year is coming up. So do you think the Democrats might try to use some of this to gain some more seats? Because right now you have the supermajority. Oh,
they definitely will. We will also use it to gain our supermajorities. I think the people of Tennessee vehemently oppose the expansion of Medicaid, the expansion of government entitlements. They I think, the average Tennessean likes the thought of economic principles and competition, not government mandates, government control. So we'll take our message to the voters as well.
We've had a little bit of a time to reflect back on this last General Assembly. What is the main, what do you think are some of the main accomplishments of what we just went through?
I think in 3 words: employment, education, and economic development. As for me and our caucus and really the entire Senate, overall that was our focus. Now, to be sure, there were a number of other issues that got attention because they seemed to be a little bit more exciting. But in terms of employment, as we speak today, unemployment is back down to 6%. I think it's as low as it's been since 2007. Education, we're working very hard to provide programs that close the skills gap so that Tennesseans can be retrained and re-educated to re-enter the modern day workforce. And economic development fits both of those nicely because as we've pursued our Tennessee Promise, the LEAP, Labor Education and Alignment Program, Drive to 55. All these things send a very positive signal to prospective employers who may want to move here or expand if they're already here, that we get it and that we're doing what it takes to provide a productive pipeline of seasoned workforce for the modern economy.
And within the balanced budget, there was $100 million for teacher pay raises, and I know that was passed over the last time. Yes. How important is it to exceed the pay for the teachers, increase that so that they stay in the public programs? You know, there's a saying that oats are expensive, but they're a whole lot cheaper the second time through. And I think what the old farmer's trying to say is the better you pay people, the more top performers you'll get. And so we want to be able to, here in Tennessee, to interest age where instead of going into industry or business, we attract the best and brightest into education. And this was part of that. We also have bought their liability insurance now. And so there's several things we did to try to recruit the best and the brightest into the education field. I know there was the first voucher program that was passed to help some of the students in the individual education plan be able to pick a school. The other voucher plans were not passed through. So yes. What's the future of something like that, do you think? Well, I'll start. The last 2 sessions, the Senate has approved 2 different types of vouchers. Opportunity scholarships, as we call them. As to the public at large, we feel that no student, no child should be sentenced to an inferior education based on their zip code. The students with special needs also presented a rare opportunity. In the first instance, the House did not agree with our approach. In the second instance, the House did. I think both chambers share concerns about the adequacy of funding for the public school system as it stands. And although I think it gathered more votes in the House this time, the standard opportunity scholarship bill fell short. Yeah, it did. It did fall short. Well, I want to, it's not a lighthearted thing, but because you went to school in Colorado, we'll bring up the cannabis oil. In Colorado, of course, they've made recreational marijuana legal and a few other things there. The Cannabis Oil Act was the first legislation in Tennessee to allow that for medical treatment for seizures. What's the future? Is this going to lead to anything else, do you think?
I've been asked that frequently, and I do not think so in terms of any, camel's nose under the tent about the decriminalization or legalization of recreational use of marijuana. We are fortunate to have 4 physicians amongst our members in the Senate, 2 pharmacists, 1 physical therapist. So we have a lot of experience there, and their experience informed us that the cannabis oil measure that we passed was appropriate and properly governed, properly restricted, where it could probably provide some great benefit particularly to children, infants, and they presented proof on that. So we were comfortable with that, but no, I don't think we'll be going the way of Colorado anytime soon.
Well, what's some of the things you're going to focus on coming into the next legislature? The planning now is underway. So what are some of the main key elements you'll be focusing on?
There's still a number of very important pieces of legislation pending, those that were filed in the first half. Folks need to keep in mind that we have 2-year legislative sessions, so we've just completed the first half of the 109th General Assembly, and we have some very interesting bills that deal with things like Facebook and the internet and who has the right to control your page after you die. The media companies think they do, and the bereaved, the decedents and their progeny think that they should have some say over what happens to those sites after they pass on to their reward. So that's one example. Glenn?
Yeah, as you pointed out earlier, we will see Medicaid expansion again. That will be debated again. You'll see several things that were begun this year that will be continued, such as I've had something I'm working on that would drive down the cost of the practice of defensive medicine. You'll see that. You'll see charter schools and voucher schools being debated again, and do we implement those in Tennessee? So the second session is usually shorter, but it's much more intense.
All right.
Now, at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, job one for all of us is to have a budget and to make sure it's a balanced budget. And I like to mention that because unlike the dysfunction in D.C., we do both of those. We balance our budget each year, and if we did nothing else in a legislative session, that would be the most important thing we could do, and it could conceivably take the entire session. For those of us who carry the budget, it actually does.
And I can play off that as well. I think Tennesseans need to be proud of their state government. If you compare us to most states in the union and the federal government, not only do we balance our budget, we cut taxes, we keep the rainy day, we stock the rainy day fund for in case of troubled times do come, and they will come. We are yet again voted the best state in the union, the best managed state in the union. We keep regulations low and government out of your way. And this allows you as a citizen to take your money, your hard-earned money, and raise your family and create wealth. And that makes for a stable society.
Representative Glenn Cassida of Franklin and Senator Mark Norris of Collierville, thank you for being our guest on Tennessee Capitol Report.
Thank you so much.
The 109th General Assembly adjourned in April, just in time for kids from all over the state to take their place as senators and representatives participating in the YMCA Youth and Government Program. High school students learn the ins and outs of state government in March, but in May, it's the turn for middle school children to write and pass legislation, some of which could end up being presented to our elected officials. We were impressed with Tennessee's youth, so we know that our state is in good hands for the coming years. Let's see the story now.
The Tennessee YMCA Youth and Government Program is the second largest in the nation. Students from across the state learn how to write and enact legislation.
One of the things I want to take with my kids is that give them a good experience of what government is about, and give them a taste of the real world. And this is a great program that does that.
But the program helps young people develop much needed skills.
I think it's extremely difficult for them. A lot of them are really shy, especially in middle school. But I think it just really opens up possibilities, and it's an extremely creative process. And I think a lot of times people think it's just about like learning about government, but when they actually engage in the act of, parliamentary debate and the large amount of research that they have to go into to get their ideas into bills, it's like a really awesome form of project-based learning.
And I will remind delegates that you can always yield any remaining time to your fellow delegates.
And cultivates leaders for the future of Tennessee.
Not every student who participates in this program will become the governor or even an elected official. But we want them to be civically engaged. Our role is to make sure these students know that they have to be part of the government process. They have to be involved citizens. They have to vote. And our students know that that's a priority because they've gotten involved at such a young age and they know how important it is.
Connor Hurley is a 4-year veteran of youth in government and an example of how the program creates young leaders.
When I came here my freshman year, I had no idea what I really believed in, and through being around all these people who kind of know what they believe in, being able to debate it with them has improved how I speak. It's improved how I share my own views, how everyone shares their own views, and it helps you see both sides of an issue. It helps you see the good and bad of everything. And I love how we're able to come together and really solve problems, and we're only high schoolers.
Just the idea of getting things done. I think people in Washington are a little bit too caught up in party politics, and a lot less of that exists here. You're not a Republican, you're not a Democrat, you're just a representative here. And so we vote for what we believe in, we vote for what will create positive change, and it's not so much determined by people who are lobbying us, by money, by constituents. It's really about what's going to be the best for the people of Tennessee.
Kids are not partisan politicians, but wait until they grow up, right? Joining me now for the Democratic viewpoint of this year's sessions are Senate Democratic leader Senator Lee Harris from Memphis and the party caucus chairman in the House, Representative Mike Stewart. Welcome to Tennessee Capitol Report. Let's first start with some of the bipartisan issues. What are some of the areas where the Democrats and the Republicans were kind of on the same page and got some legislation passed?
Well, one of the areas where we should have been on the same page, of course, is Insure Tennessee. So that was probably the biggest issue of this legislative session. And all told, it was a missed opportunity. So it was brought by the governor. It was a Republican initiative. I had some qualms with it because, again, it was brought by the governor. But nonetheless, it was a good faith compromise. And it was a bill that deserved to be heard on the floor. We heard it in the special session in committee, but didn't make it out of the committee, unfortunately. We went to the regular session. In the regular session, Democrats carried the bill. We made it out of the first committee, the first hurdle, but didn't go further than that. And so it was a missed opportunity. It was a bill that could have provided insurance for over 300,000 Tennesseans. And unfortunately, we didn't have the debate, which is what we were here to do.
So my understanding is that in some form or fashion, that'll definitely come up again. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's no question. I think that's what's so disappointing. I mean, you talked about bipartisanship. I think what we saw this session is really a Republican supermajority consistently putting forward sort of very radical Washington politics and ignoring what the people of Tennessee wanted. So, for example, with Insure Tennessee, we recently had a Vanderbilt poll that showed, not surprisingly, that Tennesseans are overwhelmingly in favor of Insure Tennessee. After all, it's the governor's program. Yet the governor's own party defied him and essentially made that an impossibility this session. That was a real disappointment. And that's just an example of them putting essentially the interests of outside groups like the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, these radicals from outside the state, over the interests of people in Tennessee, and in fact, over the plan and proposal of their own governor. It's very disappointing.
Well, the Republicans have the supermajority right now with an election year coming up. So what kind of things are the Democrats going to do to try to grab some more seats, especially outside of Memphis and Nashville?
I think you raised an important issue. 2016 is going to be an important election. Of course, we've got presidential elections. There's going to be higher turnout. And so we've got some pretty, reasonable but high expectations. But the point of the Democrats is not just campaigning. The point of Democrats is to make sure we make good policy. And so our first order of business is make sure Tennesseans understand that we had an opportunity to provide insurance for hundreds of thousands of people and to really solve a health care issue in this state, and we didn't do it. And so we'll go on a road trip, we'll go across the state of Tennessee and really take that message to Tennesseans because they're the boss. And if they find out that we're not living up to expectations here, then hopefully not only will we finally get heard on Insure Tennessee, but we'll also win some elections, and that'll be the gravy.
Abortion is always a difficult issue. It's a very personal issue for a lot of people in the state. There were some changes to the abortion laws this time. What do you think was accomplished?
I don't think very much was accomplished. If the principal objective was to do something about unwanted pregnancies, then nothing was accomplished. All we did was make it harder for women to enjoy their reproductive freedom and a right to privacy and non-interference from government. And so the legislature passed a 48-hour waiting period, and they also passed some licensure requirements. Now, we debated that on the floor, and the goal of that debate was to show that, hey, we haven't talked to any professional healthcare providers. We haven't heard any testimony from them. We don't know how this is going to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies. There are other ways we can all work together and respect privacy and reproductive freedom to actually get something done. Better ways. We offered alternatives, but none of those were fully fleshed out and heard. And I think one of the reasons, unfortunately, based on just my observations, was it was driven a lot by special interest groups. And so we've got an influx of special interest money in Tennessee, unfortunately, and those special interest groups kind of call the game. And so even if there is a better way to do things, there's not a lot of flexibility, or I didn't see a lot of flexibility to really craft the best policy possible.
Well, and that debate really illustrated the influence of outside special interests and just how far out the Republicans have gotten, because in that debate, for example, there was a simple amendment to make a rape and incest exception to the waiting period law, and Tennesseans are overwhelmingly for that. They don't think you should restrict a woman's rights when it comes to somebody who has suffered one of those horrible incidents. And yet, nevertheless, the Republican majority declined to put that exception in the bill. They had an opportunity to do so, and I think, as Leader Harris said, that represents people who are beholden to special interests from outside the state and not really listening to their own people.
Guns in Parks was one of the bills that was passed with the national, the NRA coming to town, that convention. There's been a lot of gun bills that were thrown out there this year. What's the Democratic thought on the future of the gun bills for the next legislative session?
Well, obviously you're going to have a lot. I mean, gun bills among some folks have become kind of a fad, and we have many, many gun bills coming before us, which is strange because Tennessee has always been a state that embraced the Second Amendment, the personal right to keep and bear arms, has never put great restrictions on gun ownership. But for whatever reason, we're having a lot of gun bills. I'm hopeful that guns in parks, which I didn't support personally, I'm hopeful that that represents kind of the high water mark for this effort, and that now we can move on to other things, because I don't think most people in Tennessee think that their freedoms with respect to their Second Amendment rights are really highly restricted. Most people don't feel the need to take a gun down to their kids' ballpark.
Other changes with carry permits, things like that. What are your thoughts on that?
So we saw dozens of bills with respect to guns. So we saw guns in parking lots at your place of work, guns in parking lots at school, guns at extracurricular activities at school. We saw guns in playgrounds, guns in parks, guns on street corners, dozens and dozens of bills filed. And I didn't support many of those bills. In fact, I don't think I supported any of them. And the point was, the reason why is because I respect the Second Amendment, as I think all the members of our caucus do, but in the city of Memphis, there's a different context. And many people in the city of Memphis rely on law enforcement as their principal response if a criminal event should occur. And so we've got to do what we can to make sure law enforcement has the tools to respond to criminal incidents. If everybody has a gun, they can't tell friend from foe, and it makes their job more difficult. We saw a little bit of that debate when we discussed guns in the Capitol. And the state troopers came in and said, you can't have guns in the Capitol. That'll make our job as state troopers more difficult. Well, the same thing is true for the City of Memphis Police Department in some of our parks, and the same is true in some of the other major metropolitan areas throughout the state of Tennessee. So we've got to figure out a way to make sure law enforcement can do their job. It's not about impugning folks who want to have a lawful permit. It's about making sure people are safe, and in some places across the state, people depend on law enforcement.
Representative Stewart, talk about another bill that you think might be important to come up in the future.
Sure. I think you're going to see a lot of legislation building on Representative Gloria Johnson's community schools legislation, which has already passed. That bill got this process started, but community schools are a concept that takes our public schools and expands the services available to children, particularly our most challenged children, and helps neighborhoods essentially embrace their children and move them forward in life. And I think it's a national trend toward community schools, and you're going to see a lot of legislation introduced to make that a stronger, more robust program.
Senator Harris, what's one of the bills that you thought was important that passed or should be passed in the next legislature?
So I think that's a good question. So one of the bills that I was most impressed with was the Neighborhood Protection Act. It was a bill initiated by Antonio Parkinson, who is a Democrat from the Memphis area, and we represent some overlapping neighborhoods. And I think it responds to two of the biggest concerns in Memphis, which is neighborhoods and crime. And more or less the bill says that if you have a neighborhood association and you've got a criminal in your neighborhood, somebody who repeatedly terrorizes the neighborhood, that you can go to court and make application to the court to have that person restrained from coming back into the neighborhood. So it's restraining orders that would apply neighborhood-wide at the instigation of the neighborhood association. And I don't think that's happening anywhere else in the country. I think it's the brainchild of Representative Parkinson, and I think it's a quite innovative approach. Obviously, it is not perfect, and there are some issues, but it is something that we need to really build on, and it really zeroes in on what the issues are in neighborhoods and crime in Memphis.
Well, once again, thanks a lot, Senator Lee Harris, Representative Mike Stewart, the Democratic leaders in the House and Senate, for joining us on Tennessee Capitol Report.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, that wraps up our show for this season. We'll be back next year when the 109th General Assembly reconvenes, offering you insight into legislation that affects the lives of Tennesseans and providing access to the legislators shaping our laws. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in 2016 when Tennessee Capitol Report continues. I'm Chip Hoback.
Tennessee Capitol Report is made possible in part by...
Some games aren't played for glory. Some are played for more important reasons. That's why we partner with schools to re-energize physical education with Shape the State.
And with support by the following members of the Tennessee Credit Union League. With additional corporate support from AT&T, Rethink Possible.